Jujutsu Kaisen really is the greatest modern battle shonen. In the future, it will definitely be compared to series like the Big Three: Bleach, Naruto, One Piece, stuff before that, Yu Yu Hakusho, Hunter x Hunter, Dragon Ball. It will be on the level of those series. There's no doubt in my mind about that. But as of right now, you just got to compare it to what's coming out alongside it. My Hero Academia, Black Clover, Boruto, stuff like that, and I feel like it's on just a different level. And even if we go outside of that standard battle shonen formula, comparing it to the likes of Chainsaw Man, which I just feel like is the second best modern shonen, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like a modern shonen just because of how much it breaks the typical formula, I would still say that Jujutsu Kaisen is better just because it's more consistent. Chainsaw Man, it feels like it's revving up, especially with part 2. Like, I really enjoyed part 1. It was consistently great throughout, but part 2, it's been a little bit slower on the uptake, and just as of right now, Jujutsu Kaisen, it's been very consistent with how great it is. So I would still have to say at this point that Jujutsu Kaisen is number 1. Now, I'm way more into manga than I am into anime. The amount that I read dwarfs the amount that I watch, but I really do appreciate what the Jujutsu Kaisen anime did, because as far as the mappa adaptations goes anyway, it is the best out of the bunch, and mappa has been, really securing a lot of manga, and a lot of manga that people were really hyped for. Hell's Paradise, Chainsaw Man, Attack on Titan, Vinland Saga, all of these, and Jujutsu Kaisen still has the best adaptation. Now, of course, with Vinland Saga, it adapts the best arc in the series so far, and even though people haven't really appreciated it to the amount that it should be appreciated, I would still say that adaptation is weaker than the Wit Studios season 1. And the same thing goes with Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan seasons that were done by Wit Studios have been better than the one done by Mappa. But as for comparing it to other just Mappa creations from the very beginning, stuff like Hell's Paradise and Chainsaw Man, the problem with Hell's Paradise is just the fact that they didn't really put the effort in, or at least not that I can tell anyway, with really any aspect to it. The sound design isn't crazy. There's not a lot of animated episodes that really just blow you away. And then with Chainsaw Man, it's mostly the pacing that is the problem with that one, because Chainsaw Man, the manga just like breaks your neck with how fastly it's paced, and the anime decides to go in the complete opposite direction. And then on top of that, cutting it to where it's only 12 episodes and you only get to see the first half of what is part 1, it just does not work. They should have done 24 episodes and paced it better. So that was the problem with both of those, and Jujutsu Kaisen just doesn't have either of those problems. It was longer, it was better paced, and it just covers more content in general. So in terms of anime, Jujutsu Kaisen is on top. Now, I could talk about every plot point that's covered in Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, or even the movie for that matter, to cover all of my bases, but I don't want to do that. I don't even want to talk about Shibuya, as good as that arc is. I consider it an instant modern classic. But what I wanted to talk about, and what I am going to talk about, is the Culling Games. This is the arc that we're on right now. I recently reread it, or skimmed through it mostly, and there's just so much that happens in this arc. Is absolutely crazy. So let me go ahead and jump right in. Obviously, spoilers by the way, but it starts off at the end of Shibuya, which was just, like I said earlier, one of the craziest, one of the best arcs in modern shonen. And then we get into the reintroduction of Yuta, and we see him, of course, in Jujutsu Kaisen 0, and now he's pretty much set to execute Yuji. And then not long after that, we get Yuta versus Yuji, which just turned out to be one of the most hyped fights, at least early on. It's not going to end up being one of the best fights in this arc, but it was a pretty crazy moment. The two protagonists of the series just going head to head, and we see how out of his depth Yuji is, because he is not very powerful in this arc, or really in any arc for that matter. And it's not until he fights Yuta that we really see just how out leveled he is. It is actually ridiculous in this fight, because Yuta's not taking it that seriously. And happening at the same time is Naoya versus Choso. Now, I'm not going to talk about this one too much, because it's not that entertaining, but it did give me hope for Naoya as an antagonist, because he's just the type of character that I like, even though he is written to be extremely unlikable. I don't know why in my head that makes me like them more, but it's a very entertaining character archetype to really have. But Naoya ends up being a disappointment, not just here, but throughout this entire arc, which is going to be one of the few negatives, one of the few cons, one of the few points of criticism I have consistently throughout this arc, and I'll get into it a little bit more later. But speaking of points of criticism, the Tengen exposition is something that got memed whenever it came out. People were not too happy with the almost novel-esque explanation for pretty much everything that's going on in the Culling games. And this is something not only this series struggles with, but you can see it in Hunter x Hunter as well. Basically, these series that have these complex battle systems and power systems and whatnot, I think it's unnecessary to the degree that they explain things, because you can do it naturally in a story. That is kind of the point of any comic book, which comic books, Western comics, make the same mistake all the time. So I'm not going to fault it too much. It's not like this is exclusive to Eastern manga or anything like that. But the whole point of comics is that it's a visual medium, and it's not like there's no reading at all, but at the same time you tell the story visually as well as using words. And I feel like the use of artistic storytelling is definitely underutilized when it comes to a lot of this exposition. I just don't feel like it's entirely necessary all the time. And I am fully aware that whenever people harp on these exposition dumps, the fans, especially for Hunter x Hunter and Jujutsu Kaisen, can be a bit harsh in their reaction, saying that the people just don't want to read these long exposition dumps, which is kind of true, but at the same time they also say that they don't know how to read. I think that's pretty silly, considering that the reading level of manga is just not that high, to put it blatantly, and I think it's a pretty lazy attempt at deflecting criticism that is pretty valid in my eyes. And then we get to Yaga's death, which is a pretty small plot point, at least in the way it's presented, and the only thing we really get out of this is that very funny panel that everybody posted, even pandas cry. It's ridiculous and just wasn't that much of an impactful moment for a character that I actually genuinely liked, and him passing just didn't hit me at all. Now, I have started to realize that I titled this Jujutsu Kaisen Really Is the Greatest, and I haven't talked about it as if it was the greatest, and that does kind of stop here. Maki massacring the Zenin clan is one of the greatest moments in recent shonen, and it's like getting to witness Itachi massacring his clan. I know that's a very obvious comparison, but if it works, it works. But it's like being able to witness that as it happens. So it's just, the execution is a lot different, and I really like the way it's done here. Now, it's not that it's perfect, especially if you read it on release. There was a lot of unfinished artwork, but the moments were just so cool that I didn't really mind. But I do have to talk about Naoya again, because the dude is just a disappointment every time he shows up in this manga, and it's super unfortunate. I think his character had a lot of potential, but he lets me down at literally every single opportunity. Like, he shows up again here in a second and he disappoints you again. But Maki is amazing. Like, I love Maki, and there's more comparisons to Toji, and it all just works. I really do love this specific plot point of this arc. But the hype train does continue on, because right after that we have Enter Hikari, who has become a fan favorite character, surpassing the likes of most of the characters even at the beginning of the manga, at least side characters anyway. And I think this is mostly due to his dynamic with Yuji. Both of the characters, they are similar in terms of just their approach to everything. They're very straightforward dudes, and that makes their dynamic really entertaining, especially when it comes to their fight. We also get a little bit of insight into Hikari's abilities, which do get featured a lot more prominently later on within this arc. Now, as for some smaller scope moments that I really appreciated, I really liked when Kenjaku saved Sasaki and said, "Thank you for getting along with my son." We saw a lot earlier that Kenjaku did take back shots, and so he's basically the mother of Yuji, and this was a very big reveal, and we haven't really gotten a ton of context in terms of how Kenjaku feels about Yuji. But we do know that he doesn't necessarily love his other quote-unquote kids, so seeing how he treats Yuji, at least how he views him in this aspect, it definitely seems like there's a good amount of favoritism. And I'm excited to see this plot line be further explored, and hopefully Yuji and Kenjaku having a much more deep conversation about it. Now, this arc is very fight heavy, so we have a good amount of forgettable fights. I'm not gonna lie, and I'm also not going to cover a ton of these forgettable fights, or really any of them. I want to jump straight into Yuji versus Higuruma, which this is basically just showing how bad Yuji feels about the whole thing, and him basically admitting fault to all the lives lost in Shibuya. He does bear that responsibility for somewhat of a good reason, but at the same time, we as readers know that he's not really responsible at all for what Sukuna did. And in the end, Higuruma begins to feel the same way too. But overall, this was a super interesting look into Yuji as a character, and I think it does end up making him one of the more interesting protagonists within shonen. And it does go back to that concept to where, can you really just torture your main character into being great? And I think with characters like Yuji, Kaneki, Guts, I think they're starting to really make that point seem very true. Megumi versus Reggie was definitely a fight. One of the fights of all time, if I'm being completely honest. Basically, I didn't really care about this fight. It was mostly forgettable. It was cool seeing Megumi really get into action, but as a Durotagonist, I think a lot more people love him than I do. I'm way more excited to get into stuff that happens next. I was definitely not expecting a three-way. That being a three-way domain expansion between Yuta, Uro, and Ishigori. I can't even really replicate or try and explain the amount of hype I felt whenever I saw this for the first time. This is just a part of that weekly reading experience for Jujutsu Kaisen that is pretty much unmatched in the magazine, especially right now. But they all cast their domain expansions at the same time. Oh my god, I'm losing my voice. They all cast their domain expansions at the same time, and it doesn't really work out how any of them thought it would. It doesn't really work out in any of their favors, and that's part of what makes this super interesting. Now, everything leading up to the three-way domain expansion I also think was very entertaining. I just love seeing Yuta do pretty much anything. I think he will solidify himself, at least if he hasn't already, solidify himself as one of the best characters in the entire series. Some people say that he is their favorite, and I cannot blame them at all. He is definitely top 5, I want to say. I mean, I could be wrong. He could be just outside top 5, but he is without a doubt inside the top 10. Hakari versus Kashimo is going to be in that upper echelon in terms of fights during the Culling Games, and we get to see Kashimo pretty much get abused by the jackpot, and really Hakari being on his back foot basically throughout this entire fight. So it was very even, and nothing really felt unfair or anything like that. This is just one of the best written fights from a very technical aspect in the entire series. And it also helps that both of these characters, their personalities are just so dramatic, I think is the best word to describe it, and they just have such a fun dynamic. And I know I say that about a lot of characters. I said that Hakari and Yuji had a great dynamic, but it's not nearly as fun as Hakari and Kashimo, and I think all these elements combine to just make an amazing fight. And while we were on a good stretch there of just amazing fights, that does pretty much stop here, because Naoya makes his way back into the series fighting Maki. Now, he does do a little bit more than he's done in any of his other fights, which isn't saying much, but I figured I'd mention it. And I don't necessarily want to hate on this moment because it's Maki. Maki's my favorite character in the entire series, which I know is a normie take, but I honestly do not care at all. But when it comes to this fight, I cannot help but hate on it, or at least most aspects to it. Because Naoya comes in here and he's pretty much stomping Maki early on just because his speed output is just, it's too much for Maki. But he does not account for the fact that Maki has plot. And I do say that because through a plot device of a character, Maki does pretty much get a hyperbolic time chamber to really train and master herself and pretty much get up to the point where she is 100% Toji. That much cannot be denied, even though it couldn't really be denied before because the parallels were very much in your face. Now it is being shoved down your throat. You cannot deny that she is essentially Toji. And after this, she then absolutely stomps Naoya into the ground once again. And like I said, Naoya is just a massive disappointment. And him coming back here and even squaring up with her for a second, putting her on her back foot, it is too little, too late, and I was just tired of his character by this point in the story. But we finally take a break from just the constant fights, something that I would accept as a very valid criticism for this arc is the fact that there's just so many fights and it feels like the plot doesn't progress nearly as much as it should just because there's so much time spent on fights. But as a Bleach fan, I'm a-okay with there being this many fights, and I don't think it's necessarily stunted the plot as I would say some other people think. But we do eventually get into more of the actual plot, and we get into Kenjaku's plan and his real domain expansion, and that is US imperialism, because he essentially manipulates a lot of the world powers into attacking Japan, showing them characters like Gojo and what they can do. And essentially all these countries want to use Japan, or at least use the sorcerers, as some type of fuel resource. I thought that sounded kind of nonsensical, but I kind of get where the plot was going with that, even though I thought it was kind of goofy. But essentially, US imperialism and using all these other countries to really attack the Japanese sorcerers is Kenjaku's master plan, or at least it plays a major role in it. But speaking of Kenjaku, we get into another fight, so back to the fights again, but Kenjaku versus Choso and Yuki. This is where I was talking about Kenjaku doesn't necessarily love all of his kids equally, and we find out when he's talking to Choso just how he feels towards Choso and his siblings, which he doesn't hold them in as high esteem as he holds Yuji, or at least how he seems to hold Yuji. But I really do like a lot of the character development here for Choso and Yuki, even though it's a little bit disappointing with her character because I was really looking forward to seeing what she can do. And even if she accomplished a little bit, her character was ultimately disappointing. But Choso and him dying as a curse so he can live as a human, and Yuki delivering that line, I do think that aspect of this fight really works, even if some other elements are pretty much just disappointing. Now, as much as I loved Shibuya, and I did say it was an instant classic of an arc, so I really did love that arc, and as much as I've loved certain plot points in the Culling games, I think all of that pales in comparison to the later plot points of this arc. Stuff like Sukuna taking over Megumi, which is one of the most, if not the most wild twist experience I've ever had with a week-to-week manga. And then right after that, you get into Sukuna versus Megumi, which is more of a skirmish than an actual fight. But still, it did lead to arguably the best panel in the entire series so far. I think most people know what I'm talking about. Sukuna uses his ability. Yuji tanks right through it and punches Sukuna right in the face. Of course, Megumi was nerfing Sukuna at the time, but that does not change the fact that this panel was just insane when it came out. Now, I'm not gonna lie and say that every chapter since this moment has been a 10 out of 10, but there are certain chapters that are 100% 10 out of 10s, and stuff like Gojo Returns is one of them. And then you get pretty much right into Gojo versus Sukuna, which has been just an insane fight. It hasn't ended yet, or at least so far as I'm reading it, and I don't even want it to end. It's just been so entertaining with how Gege Akutami has really structured this fight from a technical aspect, and of course having the two coolest characters in the series go at it head to head and have Gojo actually struggle. Like, this fight has just been absolutely insane. It's been amazing. I think it will go down as the best fight in the series. I can't necessarily think of anything that would top this. This is what we have been waiting for since essentially Gojo brought it up at the beginning of the manga during that first arc. But that does lead me to thinking about this entire arc in retrospect and really examining the whole thing, because the Culling Games is really just fights, or at least that's the way it's presented. There are so many fights within this arc. It really does feel like you're just jumping from fight to fight to fight to fight. And is that a bad thing, or is that actually a good thing? Now, this is a battle shonen, so I would personally, just based off of that, lean more towards good, but at the same time, you have to progress the plot forward. I just think that Gege Akutami has done his due diligence with that, because you have stuff like Tengen's exposition, which I don't think is done in the best way, but it is progressing the plot. It is explaining the Culling Games. And then you get stuff later on like Kenjaku's Real Domain expansion, which I said was US imperialism. That was another bit of exposition, just done, I would say, in a lot better of a way. This is more of what I want to see when it comes to progressing the plot and doing these exposition dumps. This was a super interesting aspect to the story, but overall, this entire arc has mostly been fights, but they've been great fights for the vast majority of this arc. So I personally don't really hold anything against this arc in terms of all the fights, but I know that some people do. So tell me what you think. Now, as a bonus for anybody that stayed this long, I have 5 predictions going towards the end of the manga. Now, I do see Gojo beating Sukuna. I just don't think it would be a good narrative decision to have Gojo coming out of this not being on top. I just don't see it happening. But speaking of Gojo and Gojo dying, I think for my second prediction, I do think he dies, but just to Kenjaku instead of Sukuna, which I can see a lot of people having a problem with, but I think it just makes more sense. Kenjaku, maybe outsmarting him or something like that. I think that would really work. And then on top of that, him being in the body of Geto when he does it, I think that would just be thematically kind of beautiful and super tragic in a way. And then for my third prediction, I'm still a part of the group that thinks Nobara is coming back. Maybe she's not, and I'm just throwing my money in a wishing well, just completely throwing all that money away. But I do genuinely think that she'll come back eventually. But as for my fourth prediction, I do see Megumi living. Of course, I don't know how that's going to happen. I can't necessarily explain it. I'm going to let Gege Akutami do that, but I do see Megumi living. I think it would be, once again, a terrible narrative decision for him to die. And as for my fifth prediction, this is more along the lines of what I think should happen and not necessarily a genuine prediction. But Yuji should die at the end of the series. That's what got set up early on, and I think they should stick to their guns when it comes to that specific aspect. I think if they do that, it would show a lot of integrity. But man, this was a pretty long one, and I think I lost my voice a couple of times throughout filming, so thank you guys for watching, and tell me what you guys thought, and I'm out.